Good day, everyone. Welcome to Deku Universe. Today we are beginning part 1 of What If Deku Was Reborn as Freddy Fazbear's Deadliest Animatronic. The fanfiction is created by Mr. Wonder King 12 on archiveofourown.org. Now, let's begin. The room smelled like antiseptic and something sweeter underneath it. The ghost of flowers and nurse had sat on the windowsill that morning, already wilting in the fluorescent heat. Izuku Midoriya would remember that smell for the rest of her life, long after she'd forgotten almost everything else about the day her son was born. She was 26, and she was alone in the way that mattered. No husband pacing the hallway, no in-laws crowding the room with flowers and unhelpful opinions. Just her, a kind night shift nurse, and now a small, furious weight against her chest that had stopped screaming the moment she pressed her lips to the top of his head. Hisashi hadn't come. She hadn't expected him to. 3 months ago, she'd stopped expecting anything from a man who measured his worth in empty bottles. And if some foolish part of her had hoped he might show up anyway, tonight of all nights, that part of her had gone quiet now, drowned out by something bigger. "He's got a good grip on him," the nurse said, tucking the blanket tighter around small shoulders. "Some of them just lie there and blink. This one's already trying to hold on to the world. He's going to do something wonderful," Izuku whispered, mostly to herself, because it was easier to believe it out loud than just think it. "I don't know what yet, but he is." The baby cooed, an absurd, gummy little sound, and worked one hand free of the blanket to paw uselessly at the air, and Izuku laughed despite the exhaustion dragging at every part of her, despite the ache in her hips and the 2 days of LBR that had felt like 2 years. She held her son and cried the good kind of tears. And outside the window, Mizudafu's skyline blinked with the lights of a city that ran on people who could bend steel with their hands or breathe fire or turn invisible. And somewhere in all that glittering, superhuman noise, a small, undecided voice had just joined the world, entirely her own. They let her go home 4 days later. She named him Izuku, the 12th day, an auspicious one, pulled from a naming book she'd read 3 times over out of nervous habit, and carried him out wrapped in a green blanket that matched, almost exactly, the fine dusting of hair already curling on his head. For years is not very long, as time goes, but it was long enough for Izuku Midoriya to develop several settled opinions about the world. He believed, with the total conviction only a 4-year-old can manage, that dinosaurs and heroes were secretly the same thing. He believed his mother's katsudon was the finest food produced by human civilization. And he believed, above everything else, that someday he was going to save people, the way the heroes did on TV, the ones who caught falling cars and smiled for the cameras afterward like it was nothing. He'd told his mother this so many times she'd started a running tally, half joking, on the kitchen calendar. A star sticker every time Izuku announced his life's ambition anew, usually right after some rerun of an old hero's greatest save. By his 4th birthday, the calendar was constellation dance. She should have expected, then, that the Quirk clinic appointment would matter to him more than it mattered to most 4-year-olds. Most kids barely understood what was happening at the standard screening: a mildly uncomfortable scan, a doctor with a pen light, a sticker on the way out regardless of the result, because 80% of children turned up with something, and the other 20% needed the appointment just as much. Izuku understood exactly what was happening. He'd been asking about his Quirk since he was 3. "Do you think it'll be fire?" he asked in the waiting room, swinging legs that didn't reach the floor. "Or maybe I can turn into metal. Or maybe it's just really small right now, and it'll get bigger later. I read some Quirks don't show up right away. We'll find out soon, sweetheart." Izuku reached over and smoothed down a cowlick that would not, in 4 years or 40, ever stay smooth. The exam took less than 20 minutes. Izuku sat very still on the paper-covered table while the doctor studied an X-ray lit up on the wall, and Izuku watched the doctor's face instead of the film, because she'd learned long ago that doctors' faces told you things before their mouths caught up. This doctor's face went carefully, deliberately neutral. Somehow that was worse than if it had simply fallen. "Ms. Midoriya." He rolled his stool closer, so he was sitting at her eye level, which she would also remember for years because doctors didn't sit down to deliver good news. "I want to show you something." He tapped the film. A small foot, delicate bones fanned out in gray and white. "This is Izuku's left pinky toe. See how there are 2 joints here, instead of 1? In a child born with a quirk, any quirk, that bone fuses during early development. It's one of our most reliable early markers, well before the quirk itself tends to manifest. Izuku's hasn't fused. Inko heard the words land somewhere far away, like the doctor was speaking from the bottom of a pool. That means, he went on, gently, that at this time, Izuku is presenting as quirkless. I want to be careful here. A small percentage of late bloomers show changes as late as 6 or 7, so this isn't necessarily quirkless. The word felt enormous and wrong in her mouth, like she was trying to swallow something the wrong shape. Izuku, who'd been swinging his legs the whole time and working a hangnail with his teeth, looked between the two adults with the dawning, uncomprehending alarm of a child who understands something bad has happened without understanding what. Mama? What's quirkless? The doctor. And Inko would be grateful for this later in the way a person is grateful for kindness in the middle of a disaster. Crouched down to Izuku's level before answering. It means your body's still deciding what it wants to do, buddy. A kind lie, gentler than the truth. Then, quieter, to Inko, for what it's worth, and I know it doesn't feel like much right now. I've done this job 11 years, and I don't think I've met a 4-year-old who talks like this one. Ask him anything. He's sharp as a tack. That's not nothing. It wasn't nothing. It also wasn't a quirk, and in a world where 80% of humanity could crack the laws of physics with a thought, being smart wasn't the kind of thing that made trading cards or the news or the classroom seating charts that would in a few years, quietly and without any cruelty intended by the adults arranging them, put Izuku at a table by himself. He didn't cry in the office. He cried later, at home, after Inko thought he'd fallen asleep. Muffled, trying to be quiet crying, the kind of a child who's already learned his sadness makes other people sadder. Inko heard it through the wall and stood outside his door a long time with her hand flat against the wood, not going in, because she needed a moment alone in the hallway to finish falling apart before she could be strong enough to hold him. When she finally went in, he was curled in his dinosaur sheets, hiccuping, a stuffed All Might plush, worn soft from years of hugging, clutched under one arm. Am I going to be a hero? Muffled into the pillow. Inko sat on the edge of the bed and gathered him up before answering, because she needed the anchor of his small, real weight against her. I don't know what you're going to be, she told him, which was true. But I know exactly what kind of person you already are. And that never came from a quirk, Izuku. That never once came from a quirk. He didn't really understand that yet. He was 4. He held on to it anyway, the way kids hold on to things said with enough love behind them, filing it away to be understood later, the way you keep a key even when you don't know yet which door it opens. Before the diagnosis mattered to anyone else, there had been Katsuki. They'd known each other since strollers. Technically, their mothers had been friends first. And for a few years, before the world taught either of them what it was going to expect of them, they'd been close in the uncomplicated way small children are close. Mud action figures, arguments over who got to be the hero and who had to be the villain. Izuku always lost that argument and never seemed to mind. Katsuki's quirk came in early and loud. Explosion. They called it once he was old enough to register the name. A nitroglycerin-like sweat he could detonate at will. Flashy and aggressive and undeniably impressive. The kind of thing that turned heads on the elementary school playground the first time he set off a firecracker-sized bang, just to watch the other kids flinch. Did you see that? Did you see that? Katsuki had crowed, 6 years old, and vibrating with the particular joy of a child discovering he is, in some fundamental way, special. That was so cool, Kakin, Izuku had said, and meant it completely. No jealousy in it, only the pure delight of watching your best friend do something amazing. It was such an easy thing back then. Izuku cheered. Katsuki let him. It didn't survive the diagnosis. Not because Katsuki was cruel by nature, or not only that, but because 6-year-olds are ruthlessly literal creatures who haven't yet learned to be kind for its own sake, and because Katsuki had already absorbed some early, unspoken lesson that strength was the only currency that mattered, and that standing near someone with none of it made you look weaker by association. You're quirkless, he'd said, when Izuku finally told him, expecting the same easy acceptance he'd always gotten. Like, for real? You don't got anything. The doctor said maybe it's just late. That's not how it works, dummy, everybody knows that. Flat. Not even particularly mean. The way you'd correct someone about a fact they'd gotten wrong. But something in his face was already closing, a door swinging shut that would never fully open again. "So you're just nothing, then?" "I'm not nothing. Didn't say you were nothing. Said you got nothing." He spat. Actually spat, on the ground between them, a gesture he'd clearly picked up from an older kid or a movie and didn't quite know how to wield yet, so it came out performative and strange. Same thing, basically. It should have ended there. One ugly afternoon in an otherwise unremarkable friendship. Cruelty, like a lot of things, gets easier with repetition. Katsuki discovered over the following months that mocking Izuku was reliable in a way few things in his young life were. It always got a reaction. It never fought back. And slowly, without either of them quite noticing the machinery of it, Izuku became Deku. Worthless. Useless. Can't do anything Deku. The other kids picked it up because Katsuki used it, and used it because everyone else did, until by the time Izuku was 8 the nickname had entirely swallowed his name in the mouths of everyone at school except his teachers, and even a few of them slid into it without seeming to notice. Izuku found out years later, from an old dictionary page his mother kept, that Deku could also mean someone who never gives up if you looked at the kanji a certain way, if you wanted it to. He decided, privately around age 11, that he was going to keep the second meaning and let the first one die of neglect. It was a small, stubborn act of resistance nobody else ever knew about. And it was in its own quiet way the first genuinely heroic thing Izuku Midoriya ever did, deciding alone that other people didn't get to choose what a word meant to him. By the time Izuku Midoriya was 14, he had filled 11 notebooks. They lived on a shelf in strict chronological order, spines labeled in his own increasingly confident handwriting. Hero Analysis for the Future, Volume 1 through Volume 11. Each one crammed edge to edge with sketches, quirk breakdowns, combat footage analysis, and a truly staggering quantity of marginalia even Izuku himself couldn't always parse months later. He'd started them at 5, badly, mostly crayon. By 14, they were something closer to genuine engineering documents, the kind of thing that would have gotten him a research position at a hero agency in an instant, if any hero agency in the country hired Quirkless 14-year-olds, which none of them did because none of them ever had. He'd tested north of 200 IQ at 9. In a battery of exams his elementary school ran after a teacher got suspicious about how a supposedly unremarkable Quirkless kid kept correcting the textbook. Nobody made much of a fuss. There wasn't really anywhere for that fuss to go. A genius who could someday save the country's tax filings, sure. A genius who could save someone from a burning building, a hero, the only kind of famous that actually mattered in this world, not without a quirk. So the number sat quietly in a file somewhere, and used, while Izuku kept filling notebooks nobody official would ever read. He was 3 blocks from Aldera Junior High on a bright, unremarkable Tuesday when the ground shook. Not an earthquake. Mizuta forgot those maybe twice a year and they felt different, a rolling, patient shudder. This was sharper, percussive, followed by the screech and crash of a building losing an argument with something considerably larger than itself. And Izuku was moving toward the sound before he'd consciously decided to, notebook already half out of his bag, because 11 years of practice had turned this into something closer to instinct than choice. He wedged into the crowd at the barricade tape, apologizing the whole way, until he had a clear line of sight. The villain was enormous, some kind of muscle mass mutation, easily 4 meters of straining, discolored flesh, currently peeling a parked DLVRY truck off the street like picking a scab. Backdraft worked crowd control a block back, flame suppression foam already hissing over a storefront that had caught during the initial confrontation. Between the villain and the truck, weaving through restraints that looked grown straight out of the pavement, was Kamui Woods, his voice carrying the particular clarity of someone who knew the cameras were rolling. Structural tensile strength's not enough for a mass type, Izuku muttered, pen already moving without his eyes ever quite leaving the scene. He needs something that absorbs the force instead of resisting it head-on, or he's gonna— The ground didn't just shake this time. It heaved. A leg. Impossibly, a single enormous leg, easily 30 meters. Descended out of nowhere and connected with the villain's torso with a sound like a continent clearing its throat. The villain went down in a spray of shattered asphalt hard enough that Izuku felt it through the soles of his shoes. The crowd's gasp turned, half a second later, into a roar. She stood over the unconscious villain at full height, hands on her hips, hair catching the morning light at an angle Izuku would later suspect she'd planned in advance. A dozen phones came up around him at once, and she turned into every single one of them with the same easy, camera-trained smile. That's right, everybody. Your new hero's making her big debut today. Leave the rest to me. Izuku's pen was already flying. Gigantification, full body mass and volume increase scales with need footage of upper limit. Landing force alone suggests output comparable to, you writing all that down for a report or something, kid? He startled so hard he nearly dropped the notebook. An older man beside him, work uniform, thermos in hand, clearly running late to a job he was no longer in any hurry to reach, looked down at the notebook with mild, amused curiosity. Sort of embarrassed, he closed it halfway before some stubborn instinct made him stop. I want to be a hero. Someday. I like knowing how the quirks actually work, not just what they look like on TV. He braced for the laugh. He'd gotten good at bracing for the laugh. It came reflexively now, a flinch in his shoulders before anyone had even said anything. It didn't come. The man just nodded, unbothered, sipping his thermos. Good for you. World's got enough people who just watch. Go get it, kid. I will, Izuku said, and for one whole block, walking the rest of the way to school with MT Ladies Rescue still playing on a loop behind his eyes, he let himself believe it might actually be true. The feeling didn't survive homeroom. Settle down, settle down. Their teacher, a tired man named Ban whose entire personality 14 years of students had ever been able to determine consisted of sighing and holding up worksheets, tapped a stack of papers against his desk. I know, but you're all 14 now. Time to think seriously about your futures. I'm handing out the standard aptitude forms. Fill in your intended path. General studies, technical, business. I know you all think you're going to be heroes. Fill it out anyway. Don't lump me in with the rest of these extras. Katsuki, boots up on the seat in front of him, arms crossed, not bothering to lower his voice. I'm not filling out some maybe I'll be a hero someday form. I'm getting into UA, top of the hero course, first try. Nobody asked but Kogo, someone muttered 2 rows back, and half the class made small noises of agreement. The closest thing to solidarity a room full of kids slightly afraid of Katsuki but Kogo could manage. Shut it! Flat, bored, like he'd said it so many times it had stopped requiring effort. You know, I aced the mock practical last month. Highest score in the prefecture. I'm not aiming to just get into the hero course. I'm aiming for number 1. Gonna leave All Might in the dust. That got a real reaction, a ripple of disbelieving laughs, the kind of thing that would have sounded absurd out of almost anyone else and somehow didn't out of him, because everyone in the room had personally watched Katsuki Bakugo detonate a soccer ball from 30 meters and knew, on some level, he probably meant it. Midoriya is aiming for UA too, Ban said, mostly as an aside, reading down the sign-up sheet without looking up, entirely unaware or perhaps entirely aware in the weary way of a teacher who'd stopped being able to police every small cruelty in his classroom years ago, of what he'd just done. The room turned. It happened all at once, the way a held breath turns into a laugh. A snort near the window, then another, and within 4 seconds the whole class had dissolved into open, delighted laughter. The kind that cost the people laughing nothing at all, and cost the person being laughed at everything. Deku. UA. He's going to fill out a form that says hero course? Seriously? What's he going to do? Outthink the villains to death. Izuku kept his eyes on his desk, ears burning, and said nothing, because saying something only ever fed it. He'd gotten very good, over the years, at making his face into a kind of wall. Katsuki hadn't laughed. That was almost worse. He'd gone very still instead, palms flat on his desk, and when he spoke it cut cleanly through the noise and killed it. You're seriously still doing this? Not a question. Izuku looked up anyway. I'm not trying to compete with you, Kakin. As even as he could manage, which wasn't very. I'm not saying I'm on your level. I've just wanted this since we were little. I'm not going to stop wanting it just because you got nothing. He finished it flat and final, the exact cadence he'd used at 6, like 8 years hadn't changed a single molecule of the sentiment. You think the exam cares that you filled 11 notebooks with Quirk theory? You think All Might's going to look at your little essays and go, wow, this Quirkless nobody sure thought about it a lot, better let him in? It's a physical exam. Deku, you'll die in the first 5 minutes. Maybe, Izuku said, and something in his own steadiness surprised even him. I won't know unless I try. That's kind of the whole point. For just a second, so brief, Izuku almost convinced himself later he'd imagined it. Something flickered behind Katsuki's eyes that wasn't contempt. Something almost like unease. Gone as fast as it arrived, buried immediately under a fresh wave of scorn. Whatever. Do what you want. Just don't expect me to feel sorry for you when you fail. The laughter had mostly died by then, replaced by the low, satisfied murmur of a class that had gotten its entertainment for the morning and was ready to move on. Izuku picked his pen back up, opened volume 11 to a blank page, and started writing, not the aptitude form still untouched on his desk, but a fresh empty lady entry, because it was the only thing in the room that still felt like it belonged to him. The walk home should have been unremarkable. It nearly was. Izuku had his bag over one shoulder and volume 11 open in his free hand, cutting through the courtyard behind the gym because it was quieter this time of day, when a wall of heat rushed past his ear, so close it curled the small hairs there, and his notebook detonated out of his hand in a spray of scorched paper and ash. He didn't understand what had happened for a full second. Then he saw Katsuki, palms still smoking faintly, and understood completely. Kakin. 11 years of this. No performance in his voice now that the audience was gone, just something rawer, harder to look at directly. He crossed the courtyard in 4 strides and planted a boot on the smoldering remains before Izuku could think to reach for them, grinding down. 11 years of you following me around with your stupid notebook, taking notes on my quirk like you're going to need it someday. Like you and me are ever going to stand in the same arena. Kakin, that's not. Give it up. Quiet, which was somehow worse than shouting. You're not going to make it into that school. Not into any hero course, anywhere, ever, because you don't have anything, Deku. You never did. So do everyone a favor and quit pretending. He turned and walked away before Izuku could answer, hands shoved in his pockets, shoulders set in the rigid line that meant the conversation was over as far as he was concerned. Izuku didn't say anything to his retreating back. He didn't cry right away either. He just knelt in the ash and the scattered, curling pages and started, carefully, gathering up whatever hadn't burned all the way through. Half a sketch of Kamui Wood's restraint angle. A corner of his notes on backdraft's flame suppression ratios. A whole page, miraculously intact, where he'd calculated MT Lady's likely mass increase using nothing but a photograph and the known height of the building beside her. He put the pieces in his bag anyway. He didn't know why. It felt important not to just leave them on the ground. He was fine mostly on the walk home. It was only once he was in his room, sitting on the floor with the ruined pages spread out around him, that the day finally caught up to him all at once. And he found himself thinking not about anything ugly Katsuki had said in that last moment. He refused to give that any room in his head, but about a much older memory instead, one that always surfaced whenever the world made him feel smallest. A video he'd watched roughly 4,000 times since he was 4, of a man in a smoke-choked stairwell, arms full of children, smiling like carrying the weight of 100 rescued lives was the easiest thing in the world. He dug the old tablet out of his desk drawer, the one his mother had given him specifically so he'd stop wearing out the good one, and pulled the video up. He'd memorized every frame. He watched it anyway. All Might, younger, rougher around the edges than his current public image, hauling person after person clear of a collapsing building with a kind of effortless, joyful strength that looked less like violence and more like a magic trick, grinning the whole time like the danger wasn't even real to him. It's fine now, he was saying to the camera afterward, soot-streaked triumphant. Why? Because I am here. Izuku had wanted since he was 4 years old, to make people feel the way that video made him feel. Safe. Certain. Like somebody stronger than the world's problems had shown up, on purpose for them specifically. He was crying again by the time his mother knocked on the door frame. Not asking permission exactly, just announcing herself, the way she'd always done since he was small enough that closed doors made him anxious rather than the other way around. Izuku. He didn't hide the tablet. He'd stopped trying to hide this particular ritual from her years ago. She always knew anyway. Mom. His voice cracked around it. Can I still be a hero? Even like this? Even without anything? He watched something in her face come apart in real time. The careful, composed expression she wore for him crumbling before she could stop it, replaced by something raw and helpless. For one terrible moment, he thought she was about to lie to him, the kind of gentle, hollow lie parents tell children to buy themselves another day of not having to say the hard thing. She didn't lie. She sat down on the floor across from him instead, among the scorched pages of Volume 11, and pulled him into her arms. And when she finally spoke, her voice was thick and broken in a way he'd only heard a handful of times in his life. "I'm sorry." Her tears landed warm in his hair. "I'm so sorry, Izuku. I wish I could tell you yes. I wish I could tell you it doesn't matter, that all it takes is wanting it enough, because you want it more than anyone I've ever met. And it isn't fair, none of this is fair. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." It wasn't the answer he'd wanted. It wasn't really an answer at all. Just his mother's grief, offered honestly, because she loved him too much to hand him a comfortable lie. He held on to her anyway, in the wreckage of his 11th notebook, and did not let go for a long time. 3 prefectures over, in a district Izuku Midoriya had never had reason to visit, something without bones was eating a DLVRY van. That wasn't quite accurate. The villain didn't so much eat things as absorb them, folding cars and mailboxes and one unfortunate bicycle rack into the churning, translucent mass of its own body, growing larger and more indistinct with every block it crossed. It moved like spilled water finding the low ground, oozing around a corner with a wet, suckling sound that made everyone within 100 meters recoil at once. "Somebody call it in already," a woman shouted, dragging a toddler back from the curb by one arm. "Already did, lady, they're coming." "There's no end to these things," an old man muttered, mostly to himself, watching the amorphous shape swallow a newspaper stand whole. "Every week it's something new. World's just villains all the way down anymore." "That's not true." The voice came from somewhere behind the gathering. Crowd easy, confident, carrying without seeming to try. Heads turned. "There's an end to every single one of them. Has been for going on 8 years now." A ripple went through the onlookers before most of them had even placed why. Someone's phone came up. Someone else grabbed their kid and hauled them bodily toward a better vantage point instead of away from the danger, because that was simply what people did once they understood who was standing behind them. The slime villain never got the chance to notice the crowd's shift in mood. A gust of displaced air rolled through the street a full second before the fist did. And then the villain simply wasn't a coherent shape anymore. It was scattering droplets, sailing outward in 100 directions, most of it splattering harmlessly against brick and pavement while a thin, resentful tendril of itself instinctively curled backward, low to the ground, unnoticed, and slithered into a storm drain to survive for another day. All Might straightened out of his landing crouch, hands on his hips, chest heaving with the particular satisfied exhaustion of a job well done. "Problem solved," he boomed, to a chorus of cheering that followed him for 3 full blocks after he'd already leapt away. He didn't know, yet, that he'd only won half the fight. He wouldn't find out until much later, far too late to matter, that some scattered piece of that villain had survived, patient and formless in the dark beneath the street, waiting for a body worth wearing. It was 4 days after the notebook. Izuku had a new one now, Volume 12, blank except for a single entry on the first page, copied carefully from memory out of what he could still recall of the burned pages, because starting over from nothing had felt too much like admitting Katsuki had actually won something. His mother had bought it for him without being asked, left on his desk with no note, which was somehow more devastating than if she'd said anything at all. He walked home the long way that afternoon, past the shopping arcade instead of cutting through the courtyard, because he wasn't ready yet to walk past the spot where the ash had been. It would probably be gone by now. Rain, foot traffic, a groundskeeper with a broom. But he wasn't ready to find out for certain. "It's fine," he told himself, the way he told himself most things lately, like repetition alone might eventually make it true. You don't need the notebook to be a hero. You need to actually become one. The notebook's just where you keep the notes until then. He was so deep in his own head that he almost didn't notice the street had gone quiet around him. The specific, listening quiet of a place where something was about to happen, pedestrians slowing, a shopkeeper backing into her own doorway with her eyes fixed on something down the block. Izuku turned, and the something was already reaching for him. It didn't. looked the same as the news footage from an hour earlier, 3 prefectures away. How could he have known it was the same thing, scattered and reformed and hungry in an entirely different way now, smaller than before, but still enormous up close, a wall of glistening, colorless matter that smelled like standing water and rot. A limb, if that was even the word for it, whipped out and closed around his ankle before he'd finished processing that he should run. Hey, let go. It didn't let go. It climbed. Izuku felt it slide up over his knee, cold and viscous and entirely wrong, and some distant analytical part of his brain that never fully switched off even now supplied. Unhelpfully slime-type mutation, absorption and possession properties. Seeking a host body, this is exactly the villain from the news. While the rest of him thrashed and clawed at the mass swallowing his leg, his hip climbing for his face, and he understood with total, animal clarity that it wanted to wear him, to pour itself down his throat and drive his body around like a car with the real driver gagged and screaming in the trunk. Somebody help! It cut off as a tendril slapped wetly over his mouth, and the world narrowed to the specific, suffocating terror of not being able to breathe. He didn't hear the wind before it hit. He only felt the villain's grip evaporate all at once, torn away in a single concussive gust that sent Izuku sprawling backward onto the pavement, gasping, his vision swimming with spots. Texas Smash! The name barely registered before the pressure wave rolled over him a second time. Weaker at this range, but still enough to flatten his hair against his skull. When his eyes finally focused, the villain was gone. Not defeated in any visible, satisfying way, just abruptly not there anymore, dispersed into a fine mist already evaporating off the asphalt. And standing where it had been was a mountain of a man, grinning down at him with teeth like a shark's, golden hair standing straight up as if lightning had just passed through him. All Might. Izuku's brain simply stopped working for a moment. He was aware of trying to say something. Thank you, or a question, or possibly nothing coherent at all. And then the edges of his vision folded inward, and the pavement came up to meet him. And the last thing he registered before the world went dark was a huge, warm hand catching the back of his head before it could hit the ground. He woke up on a bench in a small, unfamiliar park, a jacket the size of a bedsheet draped over him, and the number 1 hero sitting cross-legged on the grass a few feet away with the patient, slightly awkward posture of someone unused to sitting still. Ah, there he is. All Might's voice was gentler now, pitched for one listener instead of a crowd. Was worried you'd taken a nastier hit than I thought. How's the head, young man? Izuku sat up too fast, and the park tilted alarmingly before settling. You're All Might. I'm actually, he caught himself, forced a breath, tried again with something closer to sentences. Thank you. You saved me. That thing, it was trying to, I know what it was trying to do. Something flickered across All Might's face. There and gone. Wouldn't have gotten far with it, for what it's worth. That kind of villain needs a compliant host. You fought it the whole way down. I could see that much before I ever landed a hit. Izuku's hand had found his bag automatically, some deep habitual reflex, and he was already flipping his notebook open to a blank page before his brain had caught up with what he was doing. I know this is probably weird, but could I get your... He stopped. There, on the inside cover of Volume 12 in careful looping script that definitely hadn't been there 4 days ago, was a message to a future hero. Keep at it. All Might. Followed by a signature Izuku would have recognized blind, in the dark, at 90 years old. You already, his voice came out smaller than he meant it to. When did you? While you were out. A small, almost embarrassed shrug. Saw the notebook fall out of your bag. Couldn't help myself, if I'm honest. Not every day I get handed something with that many detailed breakdowns of my own moveset in it. You've got the trajectory on my jump height off by about 4%, incidentally, for what that's worth. It should have been the best moment of Izuku's entire life. For about 6 full seconds, it was... Then the question that had been sitting in his chest for 10 years finally found its way out. And he couldn't stop it even as he felt the shape of it leaving his mouth like something falling off a shelf he couldn't catch in time. Can I ask you something? Something real, not a fan thing. All Might's expression shifted, some instinct in him clearly bracing. Go on. Do you think, a breath, do you think someone could still be a hero, even without a quirk? Even if they've got nothing at all, no power, nothing, but they've wanted it so bad for so long that it's basically the only thing they've ever really wanted. Could that person still? You're quirkless. Not a question. All Might had gone very still. Since I was 4. Izuku made himself keep his eyes up on the hero's face, instead of dropping them the way 12 years of practice had trained him to. I've got 2 joints in my pinky toe instead of 1. That's the whole diagnosis, actually. 2 joints instead of 1. And that's it. That's the whole rest of my life decided by the time I could barely talk. The silence that followed went on long enough that Izuku understood the answer before it arrived. He'd understood it for years, really, from doctors and classmates and one increasingly distant childhood friend. He'd just never asked the one person whose answer might have actually mattered. I want to tell you yes. All Might's voice had lost every trace of its earlier boom, gone quiet and rough in a way that sounded almost as young as Izuku felt. I really do. You've got no idea how badly I want to just say it and mean it and watch your face do whatever it's about to do. But I'd be lying to you, and you deserve better than a lie, even a kind one. I'm not asking you to lie. Being a hero means you don't get to hesitate. All Might looked down at his own hands as he said it, flexing them slowly, like the words cost something physical to produce. Every single time, someone's life on one side of the scale and yours on the other, and you jump anyway, no matter what the math says. I have jumped into burning buildings with less than a 50% chance of walking back out, more times than I could count for you. And every single time, it was some part of my quirk that got me back out again. Strength I didn't earn with hard work alone. A body that could take the hit and keep moving. He finally looked up, and his eyes were kind, and that somehow made it worse. I can't in good conscience tell a boy with no way to take that hit that he should go looking for it anyway. Not because I don't believe you'd try. Because I know you would. That's exactly what scares me. So the answer's no. It came out flatter than Izuku meant it to, all the air gone out of it. The answer is I'm sorry. A huge hand settled on Izuku's shoulder, careful, like he was worried about the weight of it. But it's the truth. And I think you're the kind of person who'd rather have the truth than something softer that doesn't hold up. Izuku nodded, because his throat had closed too tight to manage words, and because some old, exhausted part of him actually agreed. He had asked for honesty, and he had gotten it, and wanting it to have come out different didn't make the honesty wrong. All Might stayed a moment longer, like he wanted to say something else and hadn't found the shape of it yet, then rose in one smooth motion that made the whole bench creak. For what it's worth, he paused, halfway into a crouch that Izuku recognized, distantly, as the wind-up for one of his signature leaps. The world's got more than one kind of hero in it. I know that's not what you wanted to hear. Might be worth thinking about anyway. Then he was gone, a rush of displaced air and a distant, fading, keep well, young man that carried over 3 rooftops before it finally faded out of earshot, and Izuku was alone on the bench with a signed notebook, a headache, and an answer he'd spent 10 years bracing for and still hadn't braced enough. He didn't cry this time. He was almost surprised by that. He just sat there a while, notebook closed in his lap, watching the last of the daylight go orange and then gray over the rooftops, turning the hero's last words over and over without finding anywhere useful to set them down. The world's got more than one kind of hero in it. He didn't know yet how true that sentence actually was, or what it was about to cost him to find out. By the time he stood up, full dark had settled in, and he'd taken 3 wrong turns before he admitted to himself he wasn't paying enough attention to where his feet were carrying him. The streets here weren't the ones near his school. He didn't recognize the shop signs. His phone battery had died sometime during the walk without him noticing, so there was no map to fall back on, only his own increasingly uncertain memory of which direction home was supposed to be. That was when he heard the footsteps behind him change pace. "Hey, kid," a voice, low and unhurried in the specific way of someone who wasn't worried about being caught. Izuku turned halfway and found 3 men closing the distance behind him. One tall and rangy in a denim jacket gone thin at the elbows, 2 others flanking him, all 3 moving with the loose, predatory confidence of people who did this often enough to have stopped finding it exciting. "Nice night for a walk, huh?" The one in the denim jacket smiled, no warmth in it at all. "Gonna make this easy on yourself. Wallet, phone, whatever's in the bag. We're not looking to hurt anybody." so don't make it weird. Izuku's whole body went cold and electric at once, the same animal alarm from the slime villain flooding back into his limbs before his brain had finished parsing the sentence. Oh no. He ran. He didn't decide to. His legs simply made the choice for him, and the rest of him scrambled to catch up, bag banging hard against his hip, breath tearing ragged out of a throat that felt like it had been sanded raw. Behind him, laughter. Actual laughter, delighted and unhurried, the sound of people who weren't remotely worried about losing him. He ran anyway. 5 blocks, then 6, lungs burning, thighs screaming, the streetlights blurring into long orange smears at the edge of his vision. He didn't know this part of the city. He didn't know where the police boxes were, or which direction held a crowd big enough to disappear into, and every choice he made about which way to turn was pure animal instinct, no strategy left in him at all. Just away, away, away. He rounded a corner into a narrow alley and hit a wall. A dead end. Brick on 3 sides, a rusted fire escape too high to reach, no door, no gap, nothing. He spun, chest heaving, and saw the 3 shapes filling the mouth of the alley behind him, unhurried now, because they both knew there was nowhere left for him to go. That was a lot of running for a dead-end kid. Denim jacket again, closer now, close enough that Izuku could smell cigarettes and something sour underneath. Let's not make this a whole thing. Izuku's eyes darted up, sideways, anywhere, and caught, at the very edge of the alley's far wall, a service door propped a few inches open, warm yellow light and the tinny, cheerful strains of a synthesized jingle spilling. Out into the dark. He didn't think. He bolted for it, shoved through the gap before anyone could grab him, and stumbled directly into the overwhelming, blinding brightness of Freddy Fazbear's pizza. The contrast hit him like a physical thing. The alley's cold dark replaced all at once by string lights and primary colors, the smell of cheap pizza and burnt sugar, a children's birthday song looping somewhere over the speakers with a relentless, mocking cheer. He shoved past a concession stand, sneakers skidding on a spill of spilled soda, and dove into the crowd filling the main showroom, where 3 figures in enormous animal suits worked through a synchronized number on a raised stage. A bear in a top hat, a chicken with a cupcake, and a lean purple rabbit strumming a guitar that clearly wasn't producing the music actually playing, all grinning down at a sea of small children who screamed along with every chorus. Izuku didn't see any of it. Not really. He was looking backward, over his shoulder, watching the door he'd come through and waiting for it to open again. He never saw the girl in front of him until they'd already collided. "Oh my gosh, I am so sorry." She staggered back, catching herself against a table edge, dark hair falling loose from a ponytail that had clearly given up an hour ago. A name tag, slightly crooked, red Sajva in bubble lettering someone had clearly hand-drawn to match the restaurant's branding. "Are you okay? You came out of absolutely nowhere." "It's fine, I'm fine really, but I have to." His eyes kept sliding past her, back toward the door, and whatever she saw in his face made her own expression shift fast, concern chasing out the automatic apology. "But what? Hey, what's wrong?" She reached out instinctively, the way people do when someone in front of them looks like they're about to fall down, and her palm landed light against his forehead. Checking, the way you check a kid for fever, some reflex left over from watching her own mother do it 1,000 times. "You're shaking." The moment her skin touched his, something in the air changed. Sajva felt it before she understood it. A faint, cold tug at the base of her sternum, followed a heartbeat later by a flicker of pale blue light at her fingertips, visible only to her, pulsing once like a held breath. She'd felt this before, a handful of times in her life. Always by accident. Always when someone near her was frightened enough that her quirk simply reached out on its own without waiting to be asked. "Oh, no, not now, not here." She tried to pull her hand back. It was already too late. The light flared, and something in her chest lurched forward like a hook sinking through water, latching onto whatever lived behind this stranger's frightened eyes, and she felt the unmistakable, sickening sensation of her own quirk beginning to draw something out of him against both their wishes. For Izuku, the world didn't just go strange. It detonated. A cold shock hit the base of his skull, silent and total, and every sound in the pizzeria, the looping birthday song, The children's laughter, his own ragged breathing, collapsed all at once into a silence so complete it felt like drowning. The bright colors around him bled to gray at the edges. He couldn't feel his own heartbeat anymore, couldn't feel the ground under his sneakers, couldn't feel anything except the horrifying sensation of being unplugged from his own body while some other, half-formed part of him was drawn up and out through the crown of his skull like water through a straw. Sajva had touched frightened minds before. Bullies. A shoplifter, once, whose fear had tasted thin and mean. A stray cat that had bitten her hard enough to draw BLD. Its terror nothing but a flickering, animal wisp. This was not a wisp. This was a star. It came up out of him dense and blazing, emerald shot through with threads of gold. So heavy with sheer accumulated wool that it felt physically impossible for something this size to have lived inside one skinny 14-year-old boy. It wasn't just fear in it, though the fear was there, bright and present. Underneath the fear was a decade of dreams that had never once been allowed to die quietly, no matter how many times the world had tried to starve them out. Every notebook, every burned page, every sorry, but it's the truth, compressed down into something that screamed directly into the center of her skull, not in terror, but in sheer, unbearable, defiant hope. Sajva cried out and staggered, one hand flying up to clutch her own head as the sound of it, the feeling of it, tore through her like broken glass, tears springing hot and instant down her face. What? She couldn't finish the sentence. She couldn't do anything except hold on, because letting go now, mid-transfer, with the light this bright, felt like it would tear something in half. You defenderin' this loser? Get out of the way, girlie. The voice cut through her disorientation half a second before the hand did. Denim jacket, shoving her hard enough that her feet left the ground entirely, her back slamming into the raised edge of the stage as she went down. Behind her, she was distantly aware of Izuku collapsing, folding to his knees, but the star in her cupped palm never let go of its grip on him even as the distance between them stretched. I said, give us your... He didn't finish that sentence either. He'd already decided, somewhere in the last 5 blocks of adrenaline, that this had stopped being worth the trouble of asking twice. The gunshot was loud enough that for 1 full second nobody in the pizzeria moved at all. Not the animatronics still grinding through their loop on stage, not the children frozen mid-shriek, not even the man who'd pulled the trigger, staring down at what he'd done with an expression that hadn't caught up to the rest of him yet. Izuku hit the ground and didn't get back up. Sajva, thrown off balance by the shove and now reeling from a gunshot that had gone off close enough to leave her ears ringing, lost the last of her footing entirely. Her heels skidded on spilled soda, and she went down hard, her back cracking against the stage's edge. And in the half-second of pure animal reflex that followed, both her hands shot out to catch herself. One still impossibly, agonizingly full of Izuku's light, the other slapping flat and hard into the ball pit beside the stage. The star in her palm didn't hesitate. It poured, down through her arm, out through her fingers, into the churning plastic and the thick, unnamed dark beneath the ball where something ancient and formless had been waiting. Patient, hungry in a way that had nothing to do with hunger as anyone living understood it, for exactly this. The light didn't so much enter the ball pit as get swallowed by it. Gone in an instant, every bright, blazing, defiant fragment of it sucked down into the waiting dark like water down a drain. The pressure in Sajva's skull vanished all at once. The relief of it was so total it made her dizzy, her vision swimming, one hand going instinctively to her own throbbing temple. Hey, is she someone in the crowd, finally unfrozen, voice climbing toward panic. Sajva blinked hard, trying to force the room back into focus, trying to remember. What had just happened? Why her head felt like it had been split down the middle with an axe. Why there was a boy on the ground 8 feet away, not moving at all. The last few seconds sat in her memory like a photograph with the center burned out. She remembered a face, young, panicked, achingly familiar in some way she couldn't place. And then nothing. A gap. A hole scorched clean through the exact place where the answer should have been. She would never remember what she'd taken from him, or where it had gone. That single, specific memory, hers this time, not his, had been the one casualty her quirk claimed on its way through, burned out by the sheer, overwhelming size of what had passed through her all at once. She had no idea she was the reason the boy on the ground had, for one impossible instant, stopped being only a boy. Yes, the kid's dead. Denim Jacket's voice again, and there was something in it now that wasn't triumph so much as pure, ugly panic dressed up as bravado. The sound of a man who'd just done something he couldn't undo, trying to convince himself it had been the plan all along. Come on, let's move, let's move. Feet pounded away into the dark alley beyond the propped-open door. Nobody in the pizzeria chased them. Nobody in the pizzeria did anything at all, for a long moment, except stand in the ringing silence left behind by a gunshot and stare at a boy in a worn school uniform, motionless on floor tiles that had until 30 seconds ago been sticky with nothing worse than spilled cola. Somewhere above the frozen crowd, unnoticed, unremarked, the purple rabbit animatronic finished the last bar of its looping song and struck its final pose exactly on cue. Guitar raised, painted smile fixed and enormous and utterly indifferent to everything that had just happened in front of it. For hours later, the pizzeria's parking lot strobed red and blue, and the show floor that had held a birthday party that afternoon now held a very different kind of crowd. Uniformed officers threading crime scene tape between tables shaped like giant crayons. A hero and a windbreaker crouched near the ball pit with an expression of grim professional focus. A detective in a rumpled coat comparing notes with two paramedics who had, an hour ago, stopped hurrying. Izuku Midoriya arrived like a woman moving through water. They called her from the ID in Izuku's jacket pocket. An emergency contact card she'd tucked in there herself, years ago, back when he was small enough that she still worried about him getting lost at festivals, never once imagining what it would eventually be used for. The officer on the phone had been careful with his words, the specific careful of someone reading from a script designed to prevent exactly the kind of collapse that happened anyway the moment Inko understood what he was actually telling her. She didn't remember the drive. She remembered the parking lot, and the tape, and an officer's hand hovering near her elbow without quite touching her, guiding her toward the theater's main showroom with a gentleness that felt, in the moment, like the cruelest thing anyone had ever done to her. He was still there. They hadn't moved him yet, some procedural necessity she couldn't process even as it was explained to her. And so the first thing Izuku Midoriya saw of the rest of her life without her son was her son himself, small and still on cold tile, under a thin covering someone had draped over him out of a decency that did nothing at all to soften the sight. She didn't scream. She'd expected, distantly, in whatever part of her brain was still capable of expecting anything, that she would scream. Instead, she simply folded down onto her knees beside him, both hands closing in a fist around the fabric of his jacket, and made a sound that had no shape to it at all. Not a word, not a sob, just the raw, wordless noise of something inside her tearing loose from its moorings all at once. The doors of a second ambulance hissed open somewhere behind her. A doctor approached. Dr. Takeda, according to the badge, she would remember clearly for years afterward despite remembering almost nothing else about that night. His face arranged into the particular, practiced compassion of a man who had delivered this specific kind of news more times than any person should have to. He knelt beside her, careful not to intrude too far into the small, terrible space she'd made around herself and her son. Ms. Midoriya. Gentle, deliberately quiet, pitched only for her. My name is Dr. Takeda. I am so sorry for your loss. A breath, choosing the next words with visible care. We need to take him now. We need to understand what happened here tonight. No. The word came out ragged, barely a word at all. Her knuckles had gone white where they gripped his jacket, the same jacket she'd bought him 2 sizes too big last autumn because he was always growing, because there had always been more time to grow into things. No, my baby, my Izuku, please no. Not my Izuku. Ms. Midoriya. A little firmer now. A necessary cruelty deployed with obvious reluctance. Please. I know there's no version of this that doesn't hurt. But don't make this harder than it already has to be. Somewhere in the wreckage of her mind, a memory surfaced without permission. A hospital room. 14 years and some months ago, the smell of wilting flowers on a windowsill. A nurse tucking a blanket around small, furious shoulders. He's going to do something wonderful, she had told herself then, certain of it in the specific, absolute way only a new mother can be certain of anything. I don't know what yet. But he is. She had been right, in the end, in a way so much crueler than she could ever have imagined that night. He had done something extraordinary. He had lived 14 years as the single kindest, most stubborn, most relentlessly hopeful person she had ever known, quirkless in a world that measured worth by an accident of BRTH he'd had no say in, and he had never once, not for a single day, let that stop him from wanting to save people. He just hadn't gotten the chance to prove it to anyone but her. Her strength finally broke all at once, a sob tearing loose from somewhere so deep it felt like it was dragging pieces of her out with it, and she slumped forward over her son's still shoulders, every ounce of resistance gone out of her body at once. The paramedics moved in with the same quiet, practiced reverence Dr. Takeda had shown her, easing her gently back so they could do what needed doing, and Inko let them, because there was nothing left in her to fight with. Outside, the crowd of onlookers, drawn by the lights, held by the particular morbid gravity of a tragedy in progress, began slowly to disperse, their curiosity finally sated by the sight of a mother's grief made public in the worst way. The heroes on scene started packing away their equipment, crowd control no longer necessary for a scene with nothing left to control. Piece by piece, the whole vivid, terrible machinery of emergency response folded itself up and drove away, taillights fading down the block, until the only light left in the parking lot came from the pizzeria's own flickering sign, cheerfully proclaiming fun for all ages. To an empty street. Somewhere behind her, quietly, someone finally switched off the looping birthday music that had been playing, unnoticed, this entire time. By midnight, the building was empty, sealed with tape across the front doors, dark inside except for the pale glow of the exit signs and the faint, constant hum of old refrigeration units nobody had thought to power down. The animatronics stood exactly where their final cue had left them hours earlier. Guitar raised, cupcake held aloft, painted smiles fixed and patient in the dark. And in the ball pit no one had thought to search, because why would anyone search a ball pit? What could possibly be worth finding in a child's ball pit? Something that was not quite light and was not quite sound pulsed once, low and slow, deep beneath the plastic. Then it went still, and began, very quietly, to wait. Grief doesn't usually have a shape. For 3 weeks, in the dark under 1,000 plastic ball, something had been giving it one anyway. The pizzeria stayed sealed the whole time. Crime scene tape sagged in loose excess across the front doors, gathering dust, and the occasional curious moth drawn to the one security light nobody had thought to SWCH off. A birthday banner someone had hung that final afternoon, "Happy 6th birthday, EMI," stayed exactly where it was, one corner slowly working loose from its tape and drooping lower every day. The refrigeration units in the kitchen hummed on, patient and untended, keeping food cold for a business that would never open its doors again to sell any of it. Somewhere in the walls, a pipe ticked as it cooled each night and warmed again each morning. The only clock left running in a building nobody was watching anymore. And in the ball pit, in the warm, patient dark, two things that used to be separate finished becoming one thing. It didn't happen quickly. It wasn't meant to. Whatever had waited under that pit long before a frightened, brilliant boy ever burned through its door, old, hungry, formless in a way that had nothing to do with the body, took its time working a 14-year-old's memories into itself, the way a drop of ink takes its time working through a glass of water. Slow at first, then all at once, until there was no telling anymore where one ended and the other began. Emerald light, golden light, a decade of dreams and every hour spent chasing them, folded down and down and down into something small enough, finally, to fit inside a shape. On the 21st night, the shape decided to breathe. The first thing that came back was pressure, 1,000 small, hard points pressing in from every direction, and beneath that weight, a body's worth of weight, arms and legs and a chest that all belonged to something, apparently, and that something had just, for reasons it did not yet have words for, decided to exist. Sound came next. Not words, just the low electric hum of refrigeration through a wall, patient and constant. And under that, silence, so complete it had a texture, the specific hush of a building built for noise and abandoned mid-song. Though he didn't know to think of himself that way yet, opened his eyes. Blue light spilled out ahead of him before he understood the light was coming from him. It took several tries to make anything answer his intent. His first attempt to sit up sent a cascade of plastic ball rattling and rolling away in every direction, his limbs moving with the clumsy, overcorrecting force of muscles that had never once been asked to do anything before this exact moment. He got a hand under himself, big. He registered dimly wrong for fingers fused close together with a fifth held apart and separate and pushed, and the whole pit shifted and sighed under him as he rose. Unsteady, out of the plastic. Standing was worse. He misjudged the ceiling entirely, and something above him gave a hollow crack as the crown of his head connected with a support beam he hadn't known was there, and he folded down half a step out of pure reflexive alarm before some deeper, steadier instinct told him nothing had actually hurt. He tried again, slower this time, unfolding by careful degrees until he understood, with a kind of dawning astonishment, that he simply kept going up. 6 feet. 6.5. Past 7 before his spine finally settled into something like a resting posture, permanently stooped in a room built for people considerably smaller than he was. He looked down at his own hands and did not recognize them, and some part of him, quiet, old, buried very deep, understood that he shouldn't have expected to. They were yellow. Not fabric yellow, not paint yellow, a deep, saturated color that seemed to come from underneath rather than sit on top, the way a bruise holds color from beneath skin. He turned one hand over slowly, flexing the fused fingers, and where the seam should have been stitched fabric there was instead something soft and faintly warm, almost, though he had no word yet for the comparison, like flesh. He became aware, gradually, of his own mouth. It had fallen slightly open at some point without his noticing, and when he ran what might generously be called a tongue along the inside of it, he found rows and rows of teeth, close-set, wickedly sharp, arranged in a way no human jaw had ever been built to hold. What? The thought didn't finish. He didn't have the rest of the sentence yet. He only had the shape of the question, enormous and wordless, pressing outward against the inside of his skull like something trying to be born a second time. He found the door to the backroom's small employee bathroom by accident, stumbling into it in the dark while feeling his way along a wall lined with spare parts and folded tablecloths. And inside, mounted crookedly above a sink, was a mirror. He stood in front of it a long time before he made himself look up. The thing in the glass was 7 feet of yellow and shadow, blue eyes glowing low and steady like something powering on, a purple bow tie sitting fixed at the base of a throat that had no seam where the fabric should have ended and skin should have begun, because there was no fabric. It was all one thing, all the way down, at the edges, where a jaw met a cheek, where a shoulder rounded into an arm. Threads of deep, wet red showed through the yellow like something straining against a surface too thin to fully contain it. He lifted a hand. The reflection lifted its own, mirrored and exact and entirely unfamiliar. And something in his chest, did he have a chest in the way that mattered, the way a person meant it, twisted hard enough that he made a sound, low and broken and half a word, that came out as nothing but staticky noise. And then, unbidden, uninvited, something else surfaced behind his eyes. A different face. Smaller. Human soft green curls, a scatter of freckles, tired eyes that had the specific, particular kindness of someone who kept being kind anyway, at cost on purpose. He saw it the way you see something reflected in a window at night, half real, laid over the top of whatever's actually in front of you, and for one full second the two images tried to occupy the same space in his mind, the boy in the fragment, and the thing in the mirror, before they came apart again, cleanly, unmistakably, two things that had never once been the same thing at all. He didn't know the boy's name. He would eventually, though not tonight. What he knew, with a certainty that arrived whole and complete and impossible to argue with, was smaller and stranger than a name. That boy was not this. Whatever had happened to make him exist, it had not made him that boy, but taller. It had made something new out of the wreckage the boy left behind, the way a fire leaves ash that used to be a house. Connected undeniably, inseparably connected, and still not the house. Never again the house. Past tense settled over the fragment like dust. He didn't understand yet why he was so certain of the tense. He only knew, standing in front of a cracked mirror in an abandoned pizzeria at 2 in the morning, that some part of him was already quietly grieving someone he had never met. He stayed like that a long moment, blue eyes reflecting blue eyes, before some more practical instinct finally elbowed the grief aside. Out, the thought arrived, simple and entire. I need to get out. The employee exit was chained from the inside, barricaded further with a stack of folding tables someone had shoved against it during the initial investigation and never bothered to move again. He stood in front of it a while, working out with the same careful trial and error he'd used to learn his own legs, exactly how much of himself he was allowed to put into a single motion. He found out by putting too much into the first one. The door didn't so much open as stop existing. Wood and hinges and a rusted chain went in 4 different directions at once, the sound of it enormous and flat in the dead quiet building. And he stood there afterward flexing the hand that had done it with something that wasn't quite alarm and wasn't quite satisfaction. Some new third thing he didn't have a name for yet either. Oh, he thought. I see. He ducked through the ruined doorway into an alley he half recognized, though he couldn't have said from where, and from the alley into a street he'd never seen at all. And the first thing that hit him, after 3 weeks in a sealed, silent building, was light. Real light. Morning light, low and gold and impossibly, overwhelmingly bright, spilling down between buildings and catching on windows until the whole street seemed to be on fire with it. He stood in the mouth of the alley with one huge yellow hand raised against the glare, breathing. He was fairly sure he was breathing, though he wasn't entirely sure yet what that was accomplishing for him. And above him, past the rooftops, was a sky so blue and so vast and so entirely unlike anything the fragments in his head had prepared him for that something in his chest simply came undone for a second. No grief in it this time. Nothing but pure, uncomplicated wonder. Clouds, he thought, watching them move, unhurried, indifferent to everything happening below them. Those are clouds. The wonder didn't survive contact with people. The first person to see him screamed before he'd taken 3 steps out of the alley. An older man, grocery bag dropping forgotten from one hand, backing away so fast he nearly went down over the curb. The scream did what screams do. It spread. Within a block, the sidewalk had cleared in a widening circle around him. People snatching up children, ducking into doorways, phones coming up not to admire him this time, but to document him, to warn someone, to have proof. He stopped walking, stood very still in the middle of the widening empty circle, and felt something old and sore twist awake inside him. Not his exactly, but close enough to touch, an ember of memory that knew, better than he did, exactly what it felt like to be looked at like this. Like a mistake. Like something that had shown up somewhere it wasn't supposed to be. If they come at me. The thought arrived low and flat and entirely serious, some deeper animal current running under the wonder from a moment ago. If anyone tries to hurt me, I don't think I could stop myself from. He didn't finish it. Somewhere underneath the threat thought, quieter, steadier, another current pushed back against it. Not a memory exactly, more like an inherited certainty, worn smooth from years of use before it ever belonged to him. Heroes don't hurt frightened people. Frightened people aren't the enemy. Frightened people are just frightened. He let his hands unclench. He hadn't noticed they'd curled into fists at all. He kept walking, slow and careful, giving the fleeing crowd as wide a berth as the sidewalk allowed. Out past a construction site where a foreman shouted something at him that might have been a warning or might have just been surprise, and onto a wider street lined with shops he had no memory of and somehow, impossibly, still half recognized. The shape of the crosswalks, the particular cadence of a city he'd apparently lived in his whole life without ever having lived in it at all. That was when the little girl ran into the street. She couldn't have been older than 5, a small determined blur in a yellow raincoat chasing a bounced red ball across the crosswalk a full 4 seconds before the signal changed, and the car coming around the corner had no reason to expect her. And the driver's eyes went wide with exactly the kind of horror that comes half a second too late to matter. Something in him sparked before thought caught up to it. He didn't remember deciding to move. He simply was moving, the world blurring at the edges the way it had when the thugs chased him 3 weeks and 1 whole life ago. Except this time the speed belonged entirely to him, and there was nothing chasing him at all. He was the one closing distance, faster than the car, faster than the girl's own scream had finished leaving her throat. And then his arms were around her, and the pavement was gone from under his feet, and the car's horn and brakes screamed past somewhere just behind him, close enough to feel the wind of it. She had her hands clapped over her eyes, bracing for an impact that never came. When she finally opened them, she wasn't on the ground. She was 6 feet up, held against something warm and solid, looking up into a face that should have terrified her. Glowing blue eyes, a mouth full of teeth, 7 feet of yellow and shadow. And she didn't scream at all. "You caught me," she said instead, delighted, like it was the best thing that had happened to her all week. He set her down with a care that felt, even to him, like the single most difficult thing he'd done since waking up. Every motion deliberate, every ounce of the strength that had just torn a steel door off its hinges held carefully, carefully back, until her sneakers touched pavement as gently as if she weighed nothing at all. "Thank you." She beamed up at him, entirely unbothered by any of it, and before he could begin to work out how to answer, the sound in his throat coming apart into static before it ever found a word, she'd already thrown her arms around what she could reach of his middle in a hug, so sudden and so uncomplicated that he simply stood there, arms half raised, unsure what a person was even supposed to do with that. He settled, eventually, on hugging her back, carefully, as if she might break because she absolutely could have under hands built for tearing steel doors off their hinges. Yui, oh my God. A woman shoved through the reforming crowd, scooping the girl up in a single desperate motion, checking her over with the particular frantic thoroughness of a parent whose worst possible morning had just, somehow, turned out fine. She looked up at him over her daughter's shoulder, and he watched gratitude and terror arrive on her face at almost exactly the same moment, tangled together in a way that didn't seem to know how to separate. "Thank you, oh, thank you, what are you? I don't even—" She didn't finish the question. She took a step back instead, still holding her daughter close, still saying thank you, and the distance she put between them said more than the words did. He understood it. Some new, unfamiliar ache told him he understood it completely. The crowd, though. The crowd was doing something he hadn't expected at all. Somewhere behind the mother's retreat, a ragged, disbelieving cheer had started, spreading outward the same way the fear had spread minutes earlier. Faces that had flinched away from him now turning back, phones angling up again, this time not to warn anyone, but simply to keep watching. "Did you see that?" someone shouted. "That thing it caught her. It actually, where did it even come from?" The sky cracked open on the last word. "Ha! I am here." The voice hit the street like weather, enormous and bright, and entirely unmistakable. And a full second later its owner landed hard enough to spiderweb the pavement, golden hair catching the morning light like it had been waiting its whole life for exactly this entrance. The crowd's cheer redoubled instantly, disbelief giving way to pure, delighted shock. "It's All Might." He crossed the distance in 3 strides, and up close he was somehow even larger than the television had ever managed to suggest, all easy grinning confidence right up until his eyes actually landed on the 7-foot yellow creature standing in the middle of the intersection. And something in his expression paused there, just for a moment, in a way the crowd was too busy cheering to notice. "Well now, quieter, that. Just for the 2 of them. That's not something you see every day." All Might walked him 2 blocks over into the relative quiet of a small municipal park before he said anything else. One huge hand resting, lightly, almost experimentally, on a shoulder that could have shrugged him clear across the street without much effort at all. "Young man." He dropped most of the boom out of his voice, though not all of it. Some part of All Might, apparently, simply didn't have a volume lower than very enthusiastic. "That was fine work back there, truly some of the best civilian reflexes I've seen in years, but I do need to ask. Using a quirk for heroics without a license is a serious offense, even when the heart behind it is good. So, let's have it. What's your quirk?" He shook his head, slow and definite. No, you don't want to say, or..." He held up one hand, and crouched, searching the ground until he found a scrap of paper caught against the base of a bench and a half-crushed pen someone had dropped nearby. He picked the pen up with a care that surprised even him, testing the fused shape of his fingers against it before he found the grip that worked, and All Might watched, visibly startled, as 4 yellow long digits and 1 separated thumb closed around the little pen with a precision that had no business belonging to hands that size. "No quirk," He wrote, block letters careful and slow. All Might read it twice. No Quirk, he repeated, and something crossed his face that wasn't quite disbelief and wasn't quite something else, gone before it had a chance to become anything Bonnie could read. You understand that's not a common thing to say. Most people, that's not even something they'd think to claim, considering. He wrote again. I know. You know. All Might crouched down properly now, elbows on his knees, bringing himself as close to eye level as the difference in their heights would ever really allow. All right. Different question then, and take your time with it, can you? Talk at all. He nodded and opened his mouth and pushed sound out through it with everything he had. What came out wasn't a word so much as the wreckage of one, pitch climbing and dropping at random, syllables doubling back on themselves, the whole thing scraped through with a flat electric static that made even him flinch at hearing it. It fractured apart entirely on the second attempt, collapsing into pure noise before he gave up and let it die in his throat. All Might didn't flinch, which he would remember, later, as the first genuinely kind thing anyone had done for him since he'd opened his eyes in the dark. All right, that's all right. Paper's just fine. We'll do this your way. A pause, and then, gently, do you have a name? He didn't. He hadn't thought about it until the question landed, and once it landed, he found the space where a name should have been was simply empty. Waiting. Something flickered at the very edge of it. A syllable, soft and green and achingly familiar in a way that made no sense at all, rising up out of the same fragment place the freckled face had come from in the mirror. He almost reached for it. His hand actually moved half an inch toward the paper before something in him. The same quiet certainty from the bathroom mirror, not the same, never again the same, pulled it back. That name wasn't his to take. Whoever it had belonged to, it had belonged to someone smaller, softer, human, someone the fragments called him in a voice thick with grief that wasn't Bonnie's grief to claim either. He closed his eyes instead and let the rest of the fragments settle, and found, underneath all the noise, one clean, whole, untangled image, a stage. 3 shapes performing under warm lights. A bear in a top hat, a chicken with a cupcake held aloft, and between them, a lean, purple-furred rabbit, strumming a guitar that had never once produced the music actually playing, grinning its fixed painted grin at a room full of children who screamed along with every chorus. It was the last clear thing he, the boy, had seen before everything went dark. He picked the pen back up. Bonnie, he wrote, and something about the shape of the letters felt, for the first time since he'd woken up, like it actually belonged to him. Bonnie. All Might said it out loud, testing the weight of it, and nodded slowly, like it settled something for him too. All right then, young Bonnie. Well met properly this time. A beat, and then, because apparently some part of him couldn't help himself. Though I'll say, purple would have suited you. You're about the only rabbit I've ever met who came out yellow. He hadn't expected that to land the way it did. Something in his chest that wasn't quite a laugh came out anyway, low and static warped and entirely unplanned, and All Might's grin doubled in response, delighted to have gotten a reaction at all. There we go. Good. He straightened up, dusting off his knees, expression sobering by careful degrees back into something more serious. Bonnie, I have to be honest with you because I think you'd know if I wasn't. I don't know what you are. Not officially, not medically, not in any category I've got a name ready for. But I know what I watched you do back there, and I know a hero's instinct when I see one, Quirk or not. He held out one enormous hand, palm up, an offer rather than a demand. I want to take you somewhere. People who might actually be able to help you understand what's happened to you. Will you come with me? Bonnie looked at the offered hand a long moment. Then he wrote one more line, small, almost hesitant, on the last clean corner of the paper. Will they be afraid of me too? All Might read it, and whatever crossed his face then was entirely unguarded, entirely honest, and entirely his own. Some of them probably. At first, a huge hand settled again on Bonnie's shoulder. Steady. But I won't be. And I don't think that's nothing to start with. Bonnie nodded, once, and followed him out of the park. The car ride took 40 minutes, and Bonnie spent most of it with his forehead nearly pressed to the window, watching a city he apparently already half knew scroll past in a way he'd never once gotten to see it, traffic, shop fronts, a train crossing an elevated track 2 streets over, ordinary human life continuing in every direction. Utterly unaware of what had just woken up 3 weeks ago in the back room of a shuttered pizzeria. All Might filled most of the silence himself, seemingly unable to help it. A running, cheerful commentary on the school they were headed toward, its history, its principal, cleverest being I've ever met, and I do mean being. You'll understand when you meet him. The particular pride he took in the place, all of it delivered in the same booming enthusiasm Bonnie had first heard cracking open the sky over the intersection. Somewhere around the 30-minute mark, without any warning at all, the enormous man in the driver's seat simply deflated. Muscle mass draining away like water from a tub, golden hair collapsing, the whole frame folding down into something gaunt and hollow-cheeked and considerably smaller, until the person steering the car bore almost no resemblance to the one who'd climbed into it. Bonnie's hand shot up defensively before he'd fully processed the change, a low, startled sound catching in his throat. "It's all right." A dry, exhausted laugh, entirely unbothered by the reaction. "It's me. Still me, just the honest version. This form doesn't last as long as I'd like it to these days. Costs a bit more than it used to." He caught Bonnie's expression in the rearview mirror, and something gentled in his own. "Between us, all right? This part's not for the cameras." Bonnie nodded, slow and solemn, and meant it completely. The first promise he'd ever made, offered without hesitation to a man he'd known for less than an hour, because some part of him had already decided, with the same wordless certainty that had chosen a name in a park an hour ago, that this particular secret was safe with him. The gates came into view not long after. Tall, wrought iron, the letters UA worked into the stone archway above them in a script that managed to look both welcoming and formidable at once. And beyond them, a campus so vast it seemed to swallow the whole horizon, buildings rising in shapes no ordinary architecture firm would ever have dared attempt. The car slowed. Bonnie pressed both hands flat against the window, craning to take in all of it at once, and felt something entirely new unfold behind his ribs. Not the wonder from the alley, not the grief from the mirror. Something else, something that didn't have a name yet either. Beside him, thin and tired and smiling anyway, Toshinori Yagi pulled the car through the gates and said, quietly, mostly to himself, "Well, let's see what they make of you." Bonnie had learned exactly 2 things about his own body in the handful of hours since he'd climbed out of a ball pit and into the world. That it could tear a reinforced steel door off its hinges without meaning to, and that it still, somehow, in open defiance of that fact, felt very small walking through the front doors of UA High School. That didn't seem possible, going strictly by the numbers. He'd measured himself against Yagi twice in the car. Once by accident, once out of open curiosity, and came out taller both times, wider through the shoulder by a margin that would have sounded absurd if either of them had bothered to put it into inches out loud. And yet the building swallowed that fact whole the instant he stepped inside. Ceilings vaulted 3 or 4 times higher than any ordinary person would ever need. Hallways wide enough to drive 2 of Yagi's car through side by side. Stained glass windows 30 feet tall throwing fractured. Colored light across floors polished to a shine so complete that Bonnie could see his own reflection following him. Warped and yellow and enormous. A step behind wherever he went. They built this for something bigger than people, he thought. Then, a half-beat later, with a small, unfamiliar flicker of something almost like belonging. Maybe not anymore. Yagi walked half a pace ahead of him, hands stuffed deep in the pockets of a coat that hung loose on his gaunt frame. Offering a running commentary, he seemed constitutionally incapable of switching off even with his voice reduced to a fraction of its earlier volume. Built going on 60 years ago, this main building. Though don't let the bones fool you into thinking it's old just because it looks it. Cementos redos half these walls every few years, just to keep the students honest about assuming anything around here is as solid as it looks. A short, wheezing laugh. You'll like him. Calm sort. Not much rattles him. Bonnie wasn't sure yet what would rattle him either, personally, or whether he counted as the sort of thing that rattled people on principle. Judging by the last 2 blocks, the second option seemed likelier. Students were staring. Not all of them. Most simply glanced and kept walking, the particular practiced indifference of teenagers who attended a school where a classmate might casually be on fire at any given moment. But enough of them stopped dead in the middle of the corridor, textbooks clutched to their chests, that Bonnie became acutely, uncomfortably aware of every one of his 7 feet. A pair of upperclassmen near a trophy case went silent mid-conversation, one of them slowly lowering a half-eaten rice ball without looking away. A girl with her arm in a soft cast pressed herself flat against a bank of lockers to let him pass, eyes wide, though she managed a small, uncertain nod when Bonnie caught her gaze and inclined his head back at her. Careful, apologetic, trying without words to say, "I'm not going to do anything." She didn't look reassured. He couldn't entirely blame her. "Is that Tashinori?" someone whispered, not quite quietly enough, from behind a half-open classroom door, followed immediately, in a different voice, by, "No way, who's the rabbit?" And Bonnie understood, with a small jolt, that not one of them recognized the thin, tired man walking half a step ahead of him as the same person who'd cracked the sky open over an intersection that morning. It made a strange kind of sense once he turned it over. A secret only worked as a secret if it actually hid something. Still, something about watching an entire hallway of students look straight through the #1 hero without seeing him at all sat oddly in Bonnie's chest. A small, unexpected kinship. One anomaly recognizing another. They reached a set of double doors near the end of the 3rd-floor corridor, unmarked except for a small brass plaque reading faculty. Yagi paused with one hand on the handle, and for just a moment something like nerves flickered across his gaunt face. There and gone fast enough that Bonnie might have imagined it, if he hadn't already spent the whole car ride learning to read the small, human weather of this particular man's expressions. "Right," Yagi murmured, mostly to himself. "Let's see how this goes over." He pushed the door open. The room on the other side was mid-argument, or mid-discussion, at least the low, overlapping crosstalk of a meeting that had run long enough for everyone in it to grow comfortable talking over one another. A long table dominated the space, ringed with a dozen chairs, most occupied by faces Bonnie didn't recognize by name, and yet somehow, distantly, half-recognized anyway. Fragments again, flickers of familiarity attached to no clear memory, the same unsettling sensation he'd had staring into his own reflection 3 weeks ago. At the head of the table, perched on a chair built up with cushions to bring him to something like proper height, sat easily the strangest thing Bonnie had encountered since waking in the dark, which, given the rest of the morning, was saying something. Small, white-furred, some impossible, seamless composite of mouse and bear and dog that the eye kept trying and failing to resolve into any single animal, dressed in a neat little waistcoat, paws folded in front of him with an air of patient, unhurried authority that made his size feel entirely beside the point. He'd been mid-sentence. He stopped the moment the door opened, small dark eyes flicking first to Yagi with mild, theatrical exasperation. All might, precise, faintly musical, every consonant given its full weight. "How good of you to finally grace us. I calculated your arrival some 58 minutes ago, given this morning's reported incident and standard travel time. Do enlighten me. What accounts for the discrepancy?" Every head at the table turned. A tall man with a bandana and dark circles so deep under his eyes they looked almost painted on didn't bother turning fully. Just angled a bored, appraising glance over the rim of a coffee mug that had clearly gone cold an hour ago. "Yeah," he said, in a voice so flat it barely rose above a mutter. "By what?" Yagi rubbed the back of his neck, and Bonnie watched, with something almost like affection, the particular helpless honesty of a man who had never once in his life been any good at lying to people he respected. "Ah, well, I was on my way, truly, and then I got a bit distracted is the short version." Distracted. The tired man's tone didn't change at all, though something in his posture sharpened, a predator's stillness settling over him. By this," Yagi said, and stepped sideways. Bonnie ducked through the doorway. He'd gotten fairly good in the last 2 hours at judging doorframes by eye before committing his whole body to them, but the sheer volume of reaction that met him the instant he cleared the threshold still caught him off guard. A dozen professional, battle-hardened heroes, people who had presumably looked genuine monsters in the eye and lived to discuss it over coffee, went rigid at once, several chairs scraping back from the table in near-perfect unison. Bonnie straightened to his full height, ducking his head against a ceiling that, mercifully, had a bit more clearance than the hallway, and let them look. "What?" said a broad-shouldered man near the far end of the table. Red eyes narrowed beneath a heavy dark coat, voice pitched low with something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite anything else. "Is that?" Bonnie glanced behind himself out of pure reflex, the same instinct that had made him check over his shoulder outside the pizzeria 3 weeks and one whole life ago, before the obvious truth caught up with him. There was nothing behind him. They meant him. All might. Nizu's voice again, threaded now with open, unhurried curiosity. "Who, precisely, is our guest?" "This." Yagi gestured, a little helplessly, somewhere in the vicinity of Bonnie's whole existence. "This is Bonnie. He's, I want to say a person, though I'll admit I've had about 90 minutes to work that theory out, and I'm not fully sold on the wording yet. Found him on my way here, saving a little girl from an oncoming car. Fastest civilian reflexes I have ever witnessed. And that's before we get to the part where he tore a steel service door clean off a wall like it was wet cardboard." "You didn't reprimand him?" This from a broad, calm-faced man closer to Bonnie's end of the table, arms folded, more curious than accusing. "Unlicensed quirk use in public is unlicensed quirk use, whatever the intent behind it. That's rather the thing, Cementos." Yagi's mouth did something complicated, somewhere between a wince and a smile. "He says he doesn't have one." The room went for exactly 1 full second, entirely silent. Then it very much did not. "Waya!" A wiry man in dark glasses and a leather jacket shot half out of his seat, both hands slapping flat on the table hard enough to rattle every cup on it. "No quirk?" Did I hear that right, everybody, because my ears are telling me something that doesn't compute? "Sit down, Mike." The tired man again, not raising his voice, somehow cutting clean through the noise anyway. "You're going to blow a window. I will not be quieted by your doom and gloom, Aizawa. This is a legitimate moment of shock." He dropped mid-sentence into something almost conversational, jabbing a finger at the other man's mug. "And also, my man, you're too far down in the dumps today even for you. Drink something with actual caffeine in it." "What do you mean?" Cut in a woman near the middle of the table, dark curls falling over one shoulder, a riding CRP resting loosely across her knee, her usual sultry cadence edged now with genuine bewilderment. "He doesn't know what a quirk is." "Everyone knows what a quirk is. It's the first thing you learn, right after your own name." "He does know," Yagi said. I'm not explaining this well. He knows exactly what a quirk is. He simply doesn't have one, and he told me so himself in writing, because a gesture at his own throat. His voice doesn't come out quite right. Some kind of interference, but his hand's steady as anything. "Watch." He nodded at Bonnie, who reached for a legal pad someone had left near the table's edge and a proper pen, and wrote in careful block letters, holding the pad up for the whole room to see. "No quirk. Not lying." "That's," the tired man said after a beat, in a tone that had shifted from bored to considerably more alert, "interesting." "Why did he write it?" Niza asked, tilting his head, watching Bonnie with an attention so total it felt almost physical, rather than simply shaking his head. "You said his hand is steady. Presumably a gesture would have sufficed for so simple a question. Would it hurt you to just ask him yourself, Nizu?" A broad-shouldered woman with pink hair and an eye patch, arms crossed, not unkindly. "He's standing right there." Something glinted in Nizu's small, dark eyes. Not offense, genuine delight at being corrected. "Quite right, ectoplasm. My apologies." He turned the whole of his attention directly on Bonnie for the first time, and it was Bonnie found a considerably more unsettling experience than being discussed in the third person. "Young man. Why the paper, when a gesture might do?" Bonnie considered it, then wrote again, slower, working out the sentence as he went. "Want to be understood, not just guessed at." Something eased in the small creature's expression. Not quite a smile. Animals like him weren't built for smiles in any conventional sense, but something in the set of his whiskers softened. "A reasonable ambition," Niza said, "and rather more articulate than most answers I get out of fully credentialed adults in this room." A ripple of protest went around the table that he ignored entirely, sliding down off his chair and crossing to stand almost directly beneath Bonnie, craning his small neck back to take him in properly. All might. If he has no quirk, by what mechanism does he possess the strength and speed you're describing? That's the trouble. Yagi rubbed his jaw. I've watched him move. Whatever's driving it, it's fast, genuinely fast, the kind that shouldn't be possible without either a speed quirk or an enormous strength-to-weight advantage. And he's got both without having either, if that makes sense at all. I've never encountered a quirk that does what his body's doing. Not the strength, not the height, not a gesture encompassing the whole unmistakable, impossible shape of him. This. How marvelous, Nisa said, with the particular relish of a man for whom marvelous and deeply concerning occupied. Exactly the same register. Recovery Girl ought to have a proper look, I think, before we speculate ourselves in circles. Shall we adjourn there directly? I suspect several of you share my curiosity, rather too much to be left behind. The nurse's office had not been built with 7-foot patients in mind, a fact that became abundantly, comically clear the moment Bonnie attempted its doorway. He managed it by folding down nearly double, one shoulder scraping the frame with a soft, organic creak that made the small, silver-haired woman on the other side flinch. And once inside, he found the ceiling low enough that he had to remain permanently stooped, head bowed at an angle that would have given anyone with an ordinary spine a genuinely miserable afternoon. "Well," said the woman, looking up, and up, and up, at him from behind round spectacles, entirely unbothered in a way that suggested either real fearlessness or 40 years of nursing having simply burned the capacity for alarm clean out of her. "Aren't you a big one? Sit if you can manage it, dear. Bed's not going anywhere, though I make no promises about whether it'll still be standing when you're done with it." Bonnie folded carefully onto the exam bed, which groaned but held, and watched Recovery Girl. Yagi had used the name on the way in, with the specific fondness of a man who owed her his life more times than either of them cared to count. Bustle around a cabinet gathering supplies with brisk, practiced efficiency. The other teachers had filed out at her request, all but Yagi and Nizu. Right then, she produced a syringe, holding it to the light with the businesslike air of someone who'd drawn 10,000 samples and expected this one to be number 10,001. "Let's start simple. Give me your arm, Sonny." Bonnie extended it. She pressed the needle in. It did not go in. She frowned, adjusted her grip, tried again, her whole small frame leaning into it. And the needle skated sideways across warm yellow skin without so much as denting it, the way it might slide off tempered glass. On the fourth attempt at a different angle, throwing her actual weight behind it, something finally gave, the needle sinking through with a resistance that felt, to Bonnie, less like being pricked and more like being firmly, deliberately pressed on. An odd, distant pressure rather than pain. Dark red BLD welled into the chamber. She studied it against the light, eyes narrowing. "That's BLD," she said slowly. "Same color. Same viscosity, more or less." She capped the vial and fed it into a small analyzer, which hummed to life with a series of soft clicks. "Give it a minute. Let's see what type we're dealing with." The minute felt, to Bonnie, considerably longer than 60 seconds. The analyzer chimed. Recovery Girl leaned in, squinted at the readout, and went very still. "No type," she said. "Not O, not A, not B, not AB, not a single one of the standard markers this machine's looking for. It's not refusing to read the sample. It's reading it just fine. It's telling me, in its own polite little machine way, that whatever this is, it isn't matching anything in its library. 40 years I've been doing this job. Every person who's ever sat on that bed has come back with an answer on that screen." "Could the machine be malfunctioning?" Nizu asked, though something in his tone suggested he already suspected otherwise. "Could be." She didn't sound like she believed it. "Let's find out properly." She turned back to Bonnie, studying him now with an entirely different quality of attention. Not fear, not clinical detachment, something closer to the sharp, hungry focus of a scientist handed the single most interesting specimen of her career. Full scan. Skeletal, organ, soft tissue. The works. Might take a while, given your dimensions. "You all right with that, dear?" "You can say no. This isn't the kind of thing I do to someone without asking." It was, Bonnie realized with a small, strange jolt, the first time anyone in the entire building had thought to ask his permission for anything at all. He nodded. The scan took the better part of 20 minutes, a humming arm of machinery sweeping slow passes over him while he lay as still as he could manage, and Recovery Girl narrated almost nothing of what she saw as it came in, her face growing steadily more unreadable behind her spectacles. Not alarmed exactly, but caught in the specific, absorbed stillness of someone encountering something actively rewriting what they thought they knew about the world. When it finished, she sat back for a long moment before saying anything at all. "Get the others," she said finally to Yagi. "They'll want to hear this properly, not secondhand." They reconvened in the same meeting room 10 minutes later. Chairs dragged into a rough circle, everyone's earlier scattered unease sharpened now into full attention. Bonnie folded himself down against the wall near the door at Nisa's gentle direction. More comfortable, if he was honest, sitting somewhere he could see the whole room than perched anywhere central to it. "So," Nisa said, back in his cushioned chair, paws folded. "What have you found, Chio?" Recovery Girl set a thin folder on the table. Though everyone could tell from her face, she wasn't planning to read from it. The findings were plainly, entirely committed to memory already. "In 41 years of this job," she said, "I've patched up heroes, villains, and everything between. I've treated quirks that turned children's bones to something like coral. I thought I'd more or less seen the outer edges of what a body can be built to do." She looked up, over the rim of her glasses, at each face in turn, ending on Bonnie. "I have never seen anything like this, boy." "Boy," Vlad King repeated, dry, the ghost of something almost like humor cutting through his earlier wariness. "You've decided on boy, then?" "I've decided on nothing. That's rather the point," she snapped back, without real heat. "Full skeletal system. Organs, heart, lungs, a full digestive tract, kidneys, all present, all correctly positioned. A brain, and from what limited testing I could manage, an active and by every measure healthy one. Veins, capillaries, cellular structure that reads, under a microscope, essentially like any other human tissue sample I've examined." A weighted pause, which is exactly the trouble, because he isn't human. Whatever he is, it presents like a person built from the inside out, organs and bones exactly where a doctor would expect them, but the material itself is something else entirely. His skin isn't skin. It's closer to an organic shell, densely muscled underneath, fused seamlessly to whatever's beneath it with no clear boundary where one ends and the other begins. "But how?" Yagi pressed, leaning forward. "Does any of that explain the strength? The speed?" "It doesn't, not on its own. That's the part one can't hand you a tidy answer for." Recovery Girl folded her hands. "His muscle density reads 3 times denser than a peak human athlete's. Dense enough that by every measure I've got, it shouldn't move as fast as it evidently does. You don't usually get both strength and speed from the same tissue without a quirk actively cheating the physics of it for you. But there's no quirk factor present anywhere in his biology. No quirk gene expression, no secondary organ, nothing resembling what every quirk person on this planet has carried since quirk singularity. He has strange DNA, genuinely strange, sequences I don't have a reference point for, but strange isn't the same thing as quirked." "So he is," 13 said slowly, from her seat near the window, gentle even through the visible unease in it. "An unidentified biological organism. Is that the shape of what you're telling us?" "That," Recovery Girl said, "is precisely the shape of it." Silence settled over the table, thicker this time. A room full of professionals whose entire working understanding of the world was organized around quirks, being told, with total clinical confidence, that the 7-foot creature sitting quietly against their wall existed entirely outside that framework. Bonnie sat very still through all of it, watching their faces, and found himself doing something he hadn't quite expected to be capable of, cataloging them, sorting them, the way the fragments in his head seemed to want to sort everyone he met, into categories that didn't have clean names yet. Not friend, not victim, not threat, not yet, though the broad man in the dark coat kept looking at him like the classification hadn't been fully ruled out. Something else, something he didn't have a word for, sitting in a room of strangers who were, for reasons he didn't fully understand, choosing to talk about him like he might be worth understanding rather than simply worth fearing. "Well," President Mike broke the silence first, a fraction of his usual volume. subdued in a way that suited him poorly. So what do we actually do about him? We can't simply let him walk back out onto the street, Snipes said, arms crossed, drawl unhurried but firm. Not with what we just heard. Boys carrying strength that could level a city block if it ever got pointed the wrong direction, whatever's driving it. He seems friendly enough to me, Cementos offered, mild as ever. Calm. Followed every instruction he's been given all morning without complaint. I don't get the sense violence is where his instincts sit, unless he's pushed there first. That's a fine theory right up until the day it's wrong, Vlad King said, not unkindly. He's an unidentified creature, something the species has never once encountered before, walking around with all might, adjacent strength, and no ceiling on it that anyone in this room can currently name. That's not an insult to him. That's just the plain fact of what we're looking at. And if a villain got their hands on him, Midnight said, quieter than her usual register, or worse, got him to trust them the way he seems ready to trust nearly anyone kind to him. I don't like thinking about what that could look like turn the other direction. For what it's worth, Aizawa said, breaking a long silence of his own, coffee mug finally set down and forgotten. I don't trust him yet either. Don't think anyone in this room should. Off one good morning. But he's curious. Watch his eyes. He's not just sitting there waiting for something to happen to him. He's tracking every one of us, working something out. That's not nothing. In my experience, the genuinely dangerous ones don't usually bother paying that much attention to the room. Ectoplasm. Nisa's voice cut gently through the round of opinions. Small dark eyes fixed on the last teacher, who hadn't yet spoken. Your thoughts? The measured, professional-looking man considered a long moment. I think every instinct in this room is telling us to be careful, and every instinct is correct to say so. I also think fear makes for a poor long-term strategy when the alternative is genuine understanding. If he's willing to be studied, properly, humanely, not as a specimen, but as whatever he actually is, I'd rather we be the ones doing the studying. Better us than whoever finds him next if we turn him away. Every eye in the room slid, by unspoken consensus, back to the small white shape at the head of the table. Nisa let the silence stretch a moment longer than strictly necessary. Mr. Bonnie appears to me to be an anomaly the likes of which this world has never, to my knowledge, previously produced. That alone would justify considerable caution. But I find myself equally struck by what he is not. He is not, at any point since All Might encountered him this morning, behaved with malice. He rescued a child from oncoming traffic at real risk to himself, before he had any reason to believe doing so would earn him anything but fear in return. He has borne an examination that would try the nerves of a fully grown adult, let alone whatever passes for childhood in a being 3 weeks old. He listens. He watches. He asks, in his own way, to be understood rather than simply obeyed. A small paw gestured, taking in the table. I propose the following. We do not send him away, because a creature this powerful, left to wander a city alone and afraid, becomes a tragedy waiting on a headline. We do not lock him away either, because fear dressed up as caution has a well-documented tendency to manufacture precisely the monster it claims to guard against. He stays. Here, under this roof, under our collective eye, where we may study him properly and, more importantly, where he may begin to understand himself alongside us. We test him, combat, cognition, control, carefully, incrementally, with his consent at every stage. And when the new academic year brings its usual CRP of hopeful first years to our gates, I see no reason he ought not sit the entrance exam alongside them. Let him prove, the same way every other student here will be asked to prove it, exactly what he's capable of becoming. If he passes, he trains. He becomes, in time, precisely what every other student in this building is working toward becoming. And somewhere in all of that, given time enough, we may finally understand how he came to be in the first place. A final glance around the table. Agreed. There was a long beat, where nobody spoke, the pause of a room absorbing the scope of what had just been proposed before, one by one, heads began to nod. Agreed. Yagi said first, quiet, something like relief in it. Agreed. Snipe echoed, and then the rest, scattered, overlapping, until the word had gone all the way around the table. Niza turned, satisfied, toward the wall. Well, then, Cementos, would you be so good as to see about a room? Something with rather more headroom than our standard dormitories were built to offer, I should think. I can manage that. Cementos was already rising. Bonnie, Niza's voice gentled. You'll have a space of your own here, for as long as you need it. Chio will continue looking after your health. And in time, should you want it, and only if you want it, you'll have the chance to become something this school has never once produced before. What do you say to that? Bonnie looked around the room. At Aizawa's guarded, watchful patience, at Midnight's lingering unease, at present mixed cautious new quiet, at Niza's small, bright, endlessly curious eyes, and found, underneath the fear and the strangeness and the sheer overwhelming size of everything that had happened to him today, something that felt, unmistakably, like the first real shape of a future. He nodded, once, and reached for the paper a final time. Thank you, he wrote. Then, after a moment's consideration, added one more line beneath it, smaller, almost hesitant. I'll try to be worth it. Nizu read it, and something in his small, unreadable face softened into what might, on a creature built for such things, have been the beginning of a smile. I don't doubt it for a moment, he said. 3 weeks folded into each other quickly. The way time tends to when a person, or whatever Bonnie counted as, has nothing but new things to learn and nowhere urgent left to be. He became, without ever quite meaning to, something of a legend within UA's walls. It started small. A first-hand account traded between a pair of gossiping second-years who'd caught a glimpse of him crossing the courtyard at dusk, growing with each retelling until the story bore only passing resemblance to the actual event. By the end of the first week, most of the student body had at least heard the name. By the end of the second, he'd become the subject of a dozen competing rumors, traded in hushed, thrilled voices in hallways and cafeteria lines. The 7-foot rabbit thing living in the East Dorm wing. The one who doesn't have a quirk at all. Isn't that wild? I heard he ripped a car door clean off just to see if he could. He didn't mind it, mostly. There was something almost pleasant in being talked about rather than simply screamed at, even if the talk still carried its share of nerves underneath the curiosity. A few of the braver upperclassmen took to waving at him across the courtyard on their way to morning classes, and though he couldn't wave back with anything resembling casual ease, every motion of those enormous, fused-fingered hands still took real, deliberate concentration. He'd learned to duck his head in a small, careful nod that seemed to satisfy the gesture's spirit well enough. Nobody tested him, though. Not in 3 weeks, despite Niza's clear and repeated intentions to do exactly that. Staff meetings ran long. Schedules filled with the mundane, grinding business of running a school. Budget reviews, curriculum planning for the coming term, an unrelated security review after a reporter got uncomfortably close to the front gate one Tuesday afternoon. And somewhere in the press of all of it, the question of exactly what Bonnie could do kept sliding, gently a day further down the list. That changed on a bright, cloudless Thursday morning, when Recovery Girl found him in the courtyard and told him, without much preamble, that today was the day. Gym Gamma turned out to be less a gymnasium in the conventional sense and more a reinforced concrete bowl the size of a small stadium, its walls scarred with old burn marks and hairline fractures that spoke to decades of heroin training excess, ringed on 3 sides with an elevated observation deck currently occupied by nearly every teacher Bonnie had met in that first meeting room, plus a few new faces he hadn't. He walked out onto the training floor alone, the enormous open space swallowing the sound of his footsteps, and felt, for the first time since the intersection, something that might genuinely have been called nerves. Bonnie, Niza's voice, amplified slightly through some hidden speaker system, carried clean across the floor. We'd like to see the full extent of what you're capable of today. No holding back. On our account, consider this floor entirely yours to work with. Are you ready? Bonnie nodded, once, toward the deck, and settled his weight onto the ball of his feet. A shape rippled into existence a dozen meters ahead. Then another, and another, until a full dozen identical figures stood arrayed across the training floor, each one an exact, unnervingly perfect duplicate of the calm, measured teacher from the meeting room. Ectoplasm himself stood well back on the sidelines, hands folded, watching his own clones with the detached professional interest of a man who'd run this exact drill more times than he could easily count. "Whenever you're ready," he called out, and the clones began, in perfect unison, to advance. Something in Bonnie's chest changed the instant they moved. It wasn't a decision, not in any sense he could have explained afterward if anyone had asked him to. It was older than decisions, some deep, wordless current running beneath every fragment of memory he carried, flipped by a dozen identical strangers closing distance on him from every direction at once. His jaw unhinged wider than any human jaw had business opening, rows of closed set, wickedly sharp teeth bared to the open air, and a sound tore out of his throat that bore no resemblance at all to the static warped, halting speech he'd managed so far. Something low and enormous and entirely without language, a pure animal declaration that rattled loose dust from the observation deck's railing 30 meters up. "Gray." On the deck, a dozen professional heroes went very, very still. He moved before the sound had finished leaving him, closing the distance to the nearest clone in a single blurred stride, faster than anyone watching could properly track. His hand closed around the first clone's skull and simply tore, the motion so fast and so complete that the head came away clean before the body had finished registering the loss, dissolving instantly back into the same shapeless black smoke every one of ectoplasm's clones dissolved into when destroyed. No BLD, no gore in any literal sense, just void where a person-shaped thing had stood half a second before, which somehow made it worse rather than better, the sheer casual totality of it, landing in the observer's stomachs regardless of what, technically, had actually died. He didn't stop. Two more clones closed on him from either side, and he met them both at once, one fist driving clean through a chest cavity that dispersed on impact into curling black smoke, the other hand closing around an incoming wrist and simply breaking it backward with a sound like a green branch snapping, before he hauled the disintegrating clone bodily off its feet and used the momentum to slam a third straight into the concrete floor hard enough to crack it. "So that's his power," Midnight managed from the deck, her voice gone thin and unsteady in a way none of them had heard from her before. Bonnie drove one fist straight down into the cracked concrete and tore a boulder-sized slab free without visible effort, swinging it in a single wide arc that caught two more clones simultaneously and crushed them into curling smoke. And then, as the last four clones broke formation and tried, too late, to scatter, something in the shadows pooling across the far corner simply reached, dark tendrils lashing up out of nowhere to seize each remaining clone by the ankle, dragging them down and under with a speed that gave none of them time to so much as cry out before they, too, dissolved into nothing. The floor went silent. Bonnie stood alone in the wreckage, chest heaving with breath he technically didn't need, jaw slowly closing over teeth still faintly stained black with dissolving clone smoke, and looked up at the deck. Nobody moved for a long moment. Snipe finally managed, voice rough, all the easy drawl gone clean out of it, so powerful. "I have never," Yagi said, quiet, his gaunt face gone genuinely pale, "felt that much fear in a very long time. A beat, barely audible, not since All for One." Recovery Girl's hands, gripping the observation railing, were visibly trembling. Ectoplasm stood frozen at the edge of the training floor, staring at the empty space where a dozen of his own carefully controlled duplicates had existed 30 seconds earlier, his professional composure entirely gone. "When they came at me," he said to no one in particular, voice barely above a whisper. "When he actually turned and came at me, even just watching it through the clone's eyes," he swallowed hard. "I felt death. That's the only way I know how to put it. I felt what it's like to actually die." Nizu was the only one on the deck who hadn't gone still. He stood at the railing, small paws folded neatly behind his back, dark eyes fixed on the lone figure standing amid the wreckage below, and something in his expression, unreadable to everyone else, entirely genuine underneath it, had sharpened into pure, undiluted fascination. "Well," he said into the shaken silence and began, very softly, to clap. "That was extraordinary." "Nizu," Midnight started, something like disbelief in her voice. "We need," he continued, over her unbothered, already turning to gather his things, "considerably more data." This was merely the opening question. "I have a great many more to ask him." Down on the training floor, alone amid drifting curls of black smoke that had, 30 seconds earlier, been a dozen identical people, Bonnie stood very still and looked at his own hands. Steady yellow, faintly stained black at the fingertips, and felt something cold settle into the pit of whatever passed in him for his stomach. He hadn't decided to do any of that. That was the part that frightened him more than the act itself, more than the wreckage, more even than the raw animal sounds still echoing faintly in his own ears. Somewhere in the space between the clones advancing and his own jaw unhinging, there had been no decision at all. Just a SWCH, buried deep under every fragment of kindness and hope he also, somehow, carried inside himself in equal measure, waiting for exactly the right kind of threat to flip it. Kind to the people I love, he thought, distant and slow, watching a last thread of black smoke curl away into nothing above the cracked concrete. And something else entirely to everyone I don't. He didn't know yet which one the world was eventually going to need more from him. Standing alone on that broken floor, with a dozen frightened professionals staring down at him from the observation deck above, he wasn't sure he wanted to find out. This marks the end of part 1 of What If Deku Was Reborn as Freddy Fazbear's Deadliest Animatronic. A big thanks to Mr. Wonder King 12 for granting the permission to feature this amazing fanfiction. Please like the video and subscribe to Deku Universe for more interesting stories. Thank you, and see you soon.